reminder that to us that we are on the lands of Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Massachusetts, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. Lands that were the traditional territory of Native nations prior to their forced removal. As a land grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the people of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. In light of this, we must strive to become a vibrant community, inclusive of all our differences, with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. Now, before I proceed with the introduction of tonight's speaker, I would like to remind you all that MCT Modern Critical Theory lecture next week will be given by Sebastian Rand on the subject of Hegel. And for graduate students who would like to meet him, there will be a coffee hour with Professor Rand at 1:30 in the philosophy department. That's in Gregg Hall 200, and that's on the same day of his lecture. So 1:30 next Tuesday in philosophy if you'd like to chat with speaker Sebastian Rand. Well, tonight I have the great pleasure of introducing Professor Jordan Alexander Stein from Fordham University, where he teaches in the English department, as well as the comparative literature program, African American Studies and African Studies. His books include the co-edited Early African American Print Culture, that was in 2012, the authored volume Theory in the Avidly Reads series, that was 2019, and When Novels Were Books, that was 2020. And his most recent book is Fantasies of Nina Simone, and that, he said, is actually not even out yet. It's out next week. Yeah, end of the month, so fresh. In addition to his interventions in the fields of literature and area studies, Professor Stein also teaches literary theory, from Marxism to queer theory, post-structuralism, and Black studies. We asked him to deliver the first lecture in the Modern Critical Theory series because of the honest way that he has written about theory as an intellectual engagement, a passion, a frustration, and an enigma. In other words, he pays close attention to the emotional impact of ideas. And if, we have readings that are available to you on Box that you can get to very easily through the unit's website. And if you went to them and you read Stuck, as I did, that was one of the readings for today, or if you've read his Avidly Reads book, you already know this about his kind of emotional engagement with theory. For students who struggle to make sense of theory writers, who, let's face it, write badly for the most part, or who pepper their arguments with foreign words that we don't understand, or allusions to books that we haven't read, not yet, maybe never, this critical theory talk is for you. By the way, we are looking for students, grad students, willing to blog for Critic, which is the publication arm, so to speak, of the unit. If you're interested in doing that, and also if you're interested in affiliating with the unit as a graduate student, you kind of have to do it as a requirement. So please contact me or contact Ty or contact Jamie and sign up for one of the lectures to blog. It doesn't have to be complicated, it doesn't have to engage with everything. It's just your responses to the lecture. Okay, with that, I hand you the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I was extremely flattered and then highly intimidated to be the person who is coming to this unit to talk about what is theory, but I'm going to try. What you're going to hear today is kind of brand new work. I attempted to think with the prompt that I was offered and kind of follow it where it went. To my surprise, it's a lot about dinosaurs. It's about 45 minutes, and it's in 6 parts. Part 1, what is theory? One answer to that question is the dictionaries. This is the OED. Theory, without articles, so not a theory, but theory as a noun, is abstract knowledge or principles as opposed to practical experience or activity, theorizing, theoretical speculation. This definition, I think, contains some useful baselines. Theory is characterized by abstraction, and it's generally opposed to practice. Another answer to the question, what is theory, comes from the 20th century university, where theory refers to a canon of mostly modern thinkers, Kant, Hegel, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, and their subsequent uptake in especially Germany, France, and the United States, where critiques of history, political economy, category, and representation were developed, often, especially after World War II, in linguistic terms. This version of theory was often not systematic, as by contrast the philosophy of Kant or Hegel aimed to be, and rather involved an interdisciplinary melange of certain strains of psychoanalysis, qualitative sociology, dialectics, and theories of the text. Often avowedly political in nature, this version of theory tended to stand opposed not so much to practice, but to something more like naive empiricism. But if you ask me what theory is, and for some reason you have, the answer I'm inclined to give acknowledges these different meanings for theory, but puts emphasis on the ways that theory can clarify what we might call a part-whole relationship, a relationship between the general and the specific, which is how, broadly speaking, we knowledge workers tend to understand any complex system. Theory, as far as I'm concerned, denotes theory of, and the value of theories is in the ways they aid in the understanding of phenomena, often giving us understandings that cannot or perhaps should not happen only on a phenomenon's own terms. Put more colloquially, when we're in the realm of theory, the answer to the question, what's going on here, is almost never just what's going on here, because whatever's going on here is likely a member of a set, and it's that abstracting move that I think theory is so helpful with. One implication of this kind of emphasis on part-whole relationships is that yes, a theory is an abstract or speculative claim, but not all abstract or speculative claims are theories. The difference, it seems to me, is that for an abstract or speculative claim to be a theory, it needs to be tested, measured against an instance or several instances, the better to determine whether an example conforms to a pattern, or whether our understanding of that pattern, for any number of reasons, might need to be adjusted in light of the example. Just to give you an extremely schematic version of this, if you can imagine that what's in these four columns is each a distinct independent phenomenon, but they're instances, but they do share a common property, that red square that runs near the bottom. It would be possible to look at these four things and say, well, they do have this one thing in common that suggests that they may be examples of the same phenomenon, but in order for that to be true, you have to be willing to accept that the phenomenon is defined by the common property and that the other variable properties are not disqualified. Right? And that's, again, an abstracting move. It becomes a little more complicated when you test the theory again and you run into something that doesn't seem to conform to the pattern, which is this fifth column here. Four instances have a common property, that red square. The fifth one doesn't have that. So the question we're then faced with is, does the fifth instance mean that the earlier theory is wrong, which is to say in need of revision, or is that fifth instance a different kind of phenomenon, not part of the same set? And again, I think theoretical thinking is always about kind of looking at examples, trying to abstract, test them against more cases, see what happens, refine your theories. If an abstract or speculative claim, in order to be a theory, needs to be tested, what mechanism does the testing? There are a number of good answers. What I just used was observation. But another one that I've come to really appreciate is feelings. This may seem like an overly subjective measure. After all, the way one person feels can be wholly independent of the way another person feels, he said during an election season. But what supports the use of feeling as a mechanism for testing theories is the large amount of research from many different disciplines that points to the likelihood that affective states, that is, physiological or bodily responses, tend to precede or be phenomenally prior to the social conventions for naming or understanding them. Said much more simply, we tend to sense things before we know them. I don't have time today to kind of elaborate this point in greater detail, but for what it's worth, it's been established and developed by a number of contemporary thinkers influential in the humanities and beyond, including Sian Nai, Jonathan Flatley, Lauren Berlant, and most recently Anna Kornblue. All books that are worth reading and that I think have proved or are proving influential. So if you'll take the point with reference to this body of work, and if we accept that feeling as a mechanism, If we accept feeling as a mechanism that can help us test the relationship between part and whole, general and specific, instance and pattern, as a way into complex systems, then our method for arriving at a theory would be something like, first, identify what's common across different examples, different people's feelings, then to generalize, abstract, or speculate, and then to test again. That method is how I want to approach the title question of this lecture. What does the present feel like? Provisionally, I want to use this method, the one I've outlined, the method I've outlined for developing a theory, this way of positing something general and then testing it against instances, to begin to use something that seems small and personal, feelings, to scale towards something larger and shared, the present. So again, what does the present feel like? Part 2. According to Rebecca Solnit, in the opinion pages of the UK Guardian this summer, everything is weird and everyone is wrecked. To explain this affective and emotional situation, Solnit points toward a non-exhaustive cascade of unprecedented events in the last few years. The third sentence here. It's the pandemic, the 8 years of Trumpism, the distortions, disruptions, and corruption Silicon Valley has promulgated, and other looming menaces, including climate chaos. Such a set of interconnected events has in recent years been dubbed a polycrisis, a coinage whose needfulness in our vocabularies does a nice job of indexing the problem in the first place. We didn't used to need a word for this. The present often feels overwhelming, and one of the things it overwhelms is our existing language for it. After all, how can you represent our adjacency to unanticipated forms of crisis whose scale and scope, by definition, can't be anticipated? These representational challenges affect not only our language, but also our genres. In any previous era, writes Solnit, these outrages and dozens of others would have been treated as shocking scandals. Now each outrage seems to crowd out the next. As a genre, the expose is not what it used to be, a challenge that Solnit clearly recognizes without effectively being able to address. Hence her somewhat ironic conclusion that we should nonetheless keep trying to expose lies and unfreedoms because just talking about how personal the impact is of this chaotic new era matters. I don't disagree. But we're left with the situation where the newspaper column as a genre is not a solution. It offers, Solnit argues, a first step toward a solution, yet that first step, she also implies, used to be more of a solution in its own right, and in any case, the second step proves elusive. None of this makes Solnit wrong exactly so much as it locates her column in what Lauren Berlant has called a genre flail, a confusion on the writer's part about whether the writer is trying to open up the object or close the object, extend a question, or put it to rest. Solnit's column tells us something about how the present feels, and we might sense it is onto something without being able, any more than its author, to say more precisely what that something is. Or, to turn back to my initial outline of a method for theory, if this is an instance, what kind of theory emerges from it? What kind of pattern does it belong to? Let's look at another example. Part 3. I'm a big fan of Dinosaur Couch, this comic. DinosaurCouch.com. This is a multi-platform webcomic that features emotionally awkward English-speaking dinosaurs who explore and reflect on their navigation of social scenarios reminiscent of modern human relationships. There's typically an ironic rapport between the stakes of a scenario and the emotional intensity it evokes, so that, for example, as in this column, the very fact that an acquaintance is throwing a party provokes anxiety, yet an asteroid crashing to Earth is met with placid calm.
Oh no, an asteroid! Oh well, at least it's a completely random event we had no chance of stopping. Yeah, imagine how bad we feel otherwise.
Dinosaur Couch uses this irony to capture something about the psychic contradictions of existence under conditions that both are and are not within an individual agent's control, or perhaps conditions where the proportion of what is or is not within our control can be difficult to determine. One thing this comic captures, in other words, is some of what Rebecca Solnit was trying to capture in her Guardian column, how it feels to be adjacent to crisis whose scale and scope can be difficult to anticipate. It may seem like I'm making rather a lot out of what even I admit is a comic with only a slight payoff. But I include it here for the ways it exemplifies how dinosaurs, intriguingly, have become a popular figure for this kind of crisis adjacency, due perhaps to the certain fate of their annihilation. It's widely known that dinosaurs died in a catastrophic extinction event after a roughly 10-mile-wide asteroid crashed into Earth on a spring day approximately 66 million years ago. The dinosaurs' association with extinction is primary, overwhelming nearly anything else one might know about them. And let me run through some examples for you. Other comics. This is poorly drawn lines. Should we be concerned about that? Why? It's tiny. That's because it's far away. When it's close, it will be larger. Who's paying you to say this? We don't have to. This is NatalieD.com. Meteor extinction. No, I have no idea what you're talking about. I was taking a nap on the couch. This one's dark. And the last one is unattributed, but it's my absolute favorite. But all of these comics, I think, are making the same joke, which is that the only imaginable response to certain annihilation is something out of scale with it. And dinosaurs, again, it's not an accident that this scenario keeps showing up. I think dinosaurs in particular are a kind of figure for this, overburdened as figures for this kind of loss. Even the soft and cozy lines of a comic like Dinosaur Couch arguably speak to this overwhelming sense of catastrophe at a remove, indexing calamity by overcompensating with cuteness, a controlled genre flail, if you will. But what does this have to do with the present? Well, given the overwhelming association of dinosaurs with extinction, and given that the asteroid explanation is common knowledge, it's remarkable how recently it appeared as a theory. In 1980, Luis and Walter Alvarez, the interdisciplinary father-son scientific team at UC Berkeley, offered the first significant chemical and geological evidence that the end Cretaceous extinction, now more commonly known as it appears on the slide as the KPG extinction, or simply the event that killed the dinosaurs, was caused by a massive asteroid impact. 1980. The thesis received significant confirmation in 1990 with the discovery of an impact crater of appropriate size buried under Chicxulub, Mexico, on the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. One of the reasons the asteroid theory was a little slow to catch on was people reasonably said if there was a giant asteroid impact, there would be evidence of it. And it turned out it was hard to find the evidence because it was underwater. But we found it. We found it. I didn't do it. But anyway. The younger Alvarez popularized the story in 1997 in the pages of his modern classic of science writing, T-Rex and the Crater of Doom, and a scholarly review of 20 years of research formally endorsed the Alvarez hypothesis in the journal Science in 2010, 14 years ago. I think that's everyone in this room, that's in your lifetime. It is really only in the past 3 decades that dinosaur extinction and asteroids have been linked at all. To make the point another way, it's worth considering how frequently they were once not linked. In most pre-1990 dinosaur fictions, the prehistoric creatures are figures not of loss, but of competition. These plots frequently involve the human discovery of dinosaurs still alive in a globally or planetarily remote location where they hold ecological dominance and also occupy land with minerals or resources humans seek to control, leading to a contest between apex species. Dinosaur narratives are often colonial narratives in the 20th century. Such a plot persists across the 20th century, at least from Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, 1912, to Anne McCaffrey's mass-market sci-fi novels Dinosaur Planet, 1978, and Dinosaur Planet Survivors, 1984. Even Michael Crichton's 1990 novel Jurassic Park offers an inverted version of this plot, where the scientific reanimation of dinosaurs in, not coincidentally, a globally remote location, allegorizes human hubris by means of fantasies of planetary dominance that come up short against the realities of nature that can't be controlled. In Jurassic Park, we humans are competing with our own ambition. The post-asteroid dinosaur fictions, however, shifted away from plots that centered competition. James Gurney's illustrated fantasy book series, Hugo award-winning fantasy series Dinotopia, which 4 installments between 1992 and 2007, is set in the titular land Dinotopia, where dinosaurs and humans peacefully coexist, although in secret. Here, the plot is one of cooperation, as the two species work together to defend their land as well as the secret of their existence. A related plot shift structures Jurassic World, the 2015 film franchise reboot, which reprises the novel's original antagonists, the velociraptors, no longer as fearsome predators, but now as trained accomplices working for Chris Pratt. Also piloted in 1992 was the PBS hit Barney, starring a friendly and caretaking dinosaur whose signature song, I Love You and You Love Me, offered an anthem of togetherness for 22 consecutive years of children's programming. The little girl with Barney there is Selena Gomez. It was her first job. In the post-asteroid theory, post-1990 fictions, dinosaurs are no longer a threat to humans so much as both species work together and are simultaneously threatened by incursions from the outside. My extinction is, as it were, your extinction. And here, I think Dinosaur Couch fits in nicely, as, arguably, does Solnit's Guardian Column. From the perspective of both those last two texts, the present feels like a crisis, or maybe more than one, whose scale and scope can't be anticipated, with the possibility of wholesale extinction very much not outside that scope. For both texts, the present feels like a good time to recognize that we're in this together, that active cooperation may be a better approach than resource competition. And additionally, and I think most importantly for both texts, the present feels like something that strains our genres, that renders them inadequate, in need of revision, or at best ironic, and yet doesn't create new genres. One final related thing that Solnit's column and Dinosaur Couch both do to different degrees is look backwards. Indeed, one prevalent means in the present of addressing unprecedented crises in the future seems to be looking to the past. That's a working hypothesis. Now let's test it against another example. Part 4. Second, take this. What you're looking at is a graphic representing extinction, which is to say it represents a crisis whose scale and scope it is trying to document with some hope of anticipating and intervening in future trends. This graphic was built by a team of ecologists, published in a scientific journal, and based on data from the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, which is like the gold standard of this kind of data because they aggregate both governmental data and private scientific data. So it's where you go to get your data sets. Which is to say the graphic very much relies on international cooperation at the highest political and scientific levels. Meanwhile, the content of the graphic visualizes extinction on two bases. On the left, column A, is a highly conservative estimate, one in which, in this case, more species have gone extinct, that's conservative. And on the right, a conservative estimate, one in which fewer species have gone extinct. Which is to say the graphic looks backwards, very much seeking to address unprecedented crises in the present, if not also the future, by looking to the past. Distinct from our prior examples, however, this graphic doesn't immediately strain its genre. What's being visualized, and indeed what extinction technically is a measurement. As a measuring tool, extinction is a bit like an inch or a liter, where it itself cannot be said to exist in nature, even though the thing which it measures does. Right? There's no gallons in Lake Michigan, but there are gallons of water if you measure it that way. What extinction typically measures is rate, calculated in two steps. First is what's called background extinction. Background extinction, which is represented in these graphs by that little dotted line that's toward the bottom of both graphs. Background extinction is a measurement of species. Evolution dictates that species appear and disappear, right? So background extinction is a way of measuring how many species go extinct in a given period of time. So like one way to think about this is how long have birds existed? Right? Why don't you track the history of birds and figure out at different moments in time how many birds were going extinct, how many new species were evolving, and then you get a background rate against which you can measure how many birds are going extinct in a particular moment. That second measure, the particular moment, is called biotic attrition. it's usually measured in a smaller way. One, just to try to explain the math on this the way that I came to understand it. So if I were to drink 2 coffees every day for a month, the background coffee rate would be 2, right? But if one day I had a lot of meetings and I drank 4 coffees, that would be a spike. If I averaged it, it would still be 2, more or less, right? The spike would disappear. So the reason you have a background rate is you have a long Durée average, and then you have a shorter, the biotic attrition number allows you to make the spike more visible, right? And that's why you overlay these 2 numbers. And that's what's being represented in these graphs. You have the background rate, and then you have the spikes in different intervals of time for different species. If the biotic attrition number is higher than the background extinction number, you're looking at an accelerated rate, which is called an extinction pulse. If the biotic attrition number shows an accelerated rate over a duration, especially one leading to a more qualitative measurement of what gets called co-implicated ecological collapse, put perhaps too simply, if species are disappearing at a rate that messes up the food chain, which is going to lead to further problems, you're looking at what's called an extinction event. This graph I took from Wikipedia. This is this is going back 542 million years, as long as there's been life on Earth, and it's looking at extinction rates. So what's visualized in blue are extinction rates. Everything that is that has letters on top of it is understood to be an extinction event. But if you look below that, you see that there are extinction pulses, right? Where species are going extinct at a rapid rate, but not one that is actually necessarily reshaping life on the planet. Depending on who you talk to and which species we're talking about, the estimates for biotic attrition in the current decade, 2020s, are accelerated to between 1,000 and 10,000 times higher than the background rate. Now take a minute. How does that feel? Whatever your answer, it's worth noting that the measurement is not by itself designed to elicit that response. An extinction rate accelerated to between 1,000 and 10,000 times higher than the background rate sounds dramatic, perhaps, but as a measurement, all it really offers is something whose meaning is relative to a scale the measurement itself creates. The very point of a scientific measurement like this is to be accurate, which is also to say self-consistent, despite how one feels about it. Put differently, and at the risk of simplifying here, this image too may have some irony, since it is alarming, possibly upsetting, and yet the emotions it evokes are not what its genre narrowly aims to accomplish. In the world of scientific measurement, this is alarming is a conclusion, not so much a data point. So if we're reading scientific journals and getting emotional about them, which may or may not be the backstory of how the slide came about, I think we're in the realm of a genre film. Something's going on. Why do the examples and the genres that we've been looking at to index how the present feels seem to be straining? One possibility is that we're looking at the wrong genres. Maybe these examples do not belong to the set I think they do. Maybe I'm imposing a theory that's too abstract or that the examples don't support. Maybe then it's time to compare our hypothesis not to another example, but to another theory. It's part 5. In a much-discussed 2016 polemic, Amitav Ghosh argued that the general paucity of climate change fiction represents not a lack of information about what's happening to the planet, but rather a lack of imagination. Ghosh draws on the legacy of 19th century realism, whose aim was to represent the social, emotional, and often historical contours of everyday life, as these were evolving in relation to more macro-social phenomena such as urbanization, industrial modernity, European colonialism, and the rise of nationalism. Madame Bovary is one of his recurrent examples. Accordingly, argues Ghosh, a macro-social phenomenon like climate change offers a setting against which realism can be written, and the chief impediment to such fiction is an unwillingness on the part of both writers and readers to accept an evolving reality where wild or historically improbable climactic events are becoming the norm. In Ghosh's account, for climate crisis to be comprehensible, realism must evolve. From this perspective, it would seem like the examples we've been theorizing with in this lecture, Solnit's Guardian column, Dinosaur Couch's Meteor comic, and a graph of IUCN data calculating extinction rates, have been all wrong. None is a realist novel. None is in any substantial sense even a narrative. Maybe that's where we should be looking, or again, in Gauche's terms, imagining. But there are ways that realism, or at least some of its formal features, do already show up in the stories we tell about extinction. Looked at in terms of their historical discovery, dinosaurs are very much age mates with 19th century realism, and it could be argued that there is an extent to which the first conceptual vocabulary developed for imagining extinction aligned with that genre. As a tool for measuring the rates of appearance and disappearance of life on Earth, extinction developed late. The possibility that entire species could cease to exist was proposed at the end of the 18th century by Georges Cuvier, a Parisian anatomist into whose possession fell some unaccountably large molars unearthed on Shawnee lands now known as Big Bone Lake, Kentucky. Cuvier determined that they belonged to a mammoth, a quadruped species not only unknown on Earth, but even more controversially vanished from it. Using extensive fossil evidence and a great deal of showmanship, by 1812, Cuvier published his 4-volume findings identifying 49 quadruped species who had become, as he put it, extinct. His inability to name a cause for species appearance or disappearance opened up a scientific problem that was eventually solved with the theory of evolution. And it is, I think, I don't know what it means, but it feels remarkable that extinction precedes evolution in our thinking. It precedes it like developmental. Anyway, the idea of species extinction gained traction, and the identification of bones belonging to large extinct reptiles took hold in the 1820s among English geologists, and in one case, the wife of one. This is by, you can see it's by Gideon Mantell, but below his name, the engravings are done by Mrs. Mantell. Her name was Mary Ann Mantell, and she was actually like an important fossil collector. In 1842, the English paleontologist Sir Richard Owen coined the term dinosaur, using it to refer to the distinct tribe or suborder of saurian reptiles. This discovery and coinage preceded by mere decades the popularization of dinosaurs by means of civil infrastructure projects during the late Victorian and Civil War periods, eventuating in what are still world-class paleontology research centers: the American Museum of Natural History, opened in 1871, the British Natural History Museum, 1881, the Field Museum of Natural History, 1893. Historically speaking, dinosaurs appear to 19th century people more or less coincident with the high watermark of novelistic realism in Britain, France, and the United States, of the kind Gauche evokes as an unexplored solution to representing climate catastrophe. This historical coincidence is likely one reason that elements of realism persist in some of our present's best-selling texts about extinction. These narrative histories tend to center dinosaurs as characters in a crisis event, often indexed by their titles. New Yorker science journalist Elizabeth Kolbert's The Sixth Extinction, 2004, paleontologist Steve Brustati's The Rise and Fall of Dinosaurs, 2018, science writer Riley Black's The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, 2022, among others. Many of these accounts describe the KPG extinction as, to borrow Black's language, the worst day in the history of the Earth. We've seen that part of the appeal of dinosaurs in the stories we tell about them is that they are figures for loss, creatures whose fate, at least since the 1990s, could also be ours. But why dinosaurs? Extinction events have happened before in Earth's history, depending on how you count, at least 5 times. Yet no one is writing histories of, say, the conodonts, jawless vertebrates who died off during the end Permian extinction about 20 million years before dinosaurs evolved. It would seem that dinosaurs are not just figures for loss, but also figures for loss's eventfulness. The sudden, unprecedented destruction wrought by a meteor, the worst day in the history of the Earth. Dinosaur extinction stories are typically told with a unity of time, place, and action, with elements of everyday life marked by tragedy, and quite literally, with life that goes on. In these ways, their climate catastrophe could be, and I think often tacitly is, written very much as Gauche imagines, as an adapted kind of realism. I submit then that the problem is not that we don't imagine or narrate extinction in this kind of realist mode, but rather that this realist mode doesn't capture how the crisis of extinction might actually feel. Paleontologists now believe that dinosaurs did not disappear on one worst day. Yes, a significant percentage of dinosaur species, possibly as many as 75%, did die in evolutionary terms very, very quickly following asteroid impact. Many of these were creatures of enormous size, requiring significant calorie intake that became immediately impossible due to the environmental shock of the asteroid, releasing enough heat to start a fire so massive that it likely burned the entire terrestrial surface of the planet, and releasing enough debris into the atmosphere to block out the sun for months, if not years, triggering a nuclear winter. This is incidentally how you get this clay layer. It's part of what it's made of. But of the approximately 25% of dinosaur species who survived asteroid impact, some continue to exist for hundreds of more generations, likely succumbing not to direct environmental destruction, but to the evolutionary failure to reproduce fast enough for population replacement. One theory has it that dinosaur eggs, which in the case of non-avian dinosaurs may not have been guarded by a nesting parent, like birds sit on their nests, but non-avian dinosaurs, it seems like maybe didn't, which means that they laid eggs and those eggs were just there, and then became a delicacy for mammals that began to proliferate into the ecological niches that the asteroid opened up. This is not an instantaneous extinction. Though all non-avian dinosaurs did eventually become extinct, the fossil evidence dates that extinction at some point within 10,000 years after the asteroid impact. That is to say, the timeline for dinosaur extinction is roughly double that of recorded human history. Speaking as a human, a bad day is a comprehensible amount of time. 10,000 years of slow attrition really isn't. I can't imagine that. I don't know how I would begin to. But if that slow 10,000-year decline is what climate catastrophe looks like, how much would realism have to evolve to encompass something so far outside a human purview? Or to return to some of the terms we've been considering, if the present feels like we're adjacent to an extinction event, how is that even comprehensible? How can such a feeling be anything other than confusing? Let's try one last theory and then sum up. In a better world, I would be able to explain the transition here, and I can't totally, but what I can tell you is, I'm about to talk about Donald Winnicott, but what I can tell you is that if you go to knowyourmeme.com, you will find what's called the Circle of Life meme, which is a Winnicottian meme that also involves dinosaurs, so there is a connection. So you see, right, this is Winnicott's theory of the true self and false self, that the false self that we may project psychologically contains a trace of the true self we're trying to protect. But this is visualized as dinosaurs become oil, oil becomes plastic, plastic becomes dinosaurs. Or in another version, dinosaurs become chicken, chicken becomes meat, meat becomes chicken nuggets, chicken dinosaurs. So again, I'm not sure what the transition is, but I swear there is one. In his last major paper, British psychologist Donald Winnicott explored the experience of patients who sought the aid of therapy, not because they were falling apart, but because they were afraid they were about to. He later concluded that their fear of breakdown was related to difficult events in their past. What Winnicott's patients were afraid of, in other words, was the thing that had already happened, but that had not been processed by their experience. Theirs was a jumbled temporal orientation, he noted, that made treatment challenging because it required that his patients recognize that what is not yet experienced nevertheless did happen in the past. I think about this essay a lot, and my chief takeaway is something that Winnicott, I admit, does not himself conclude. My takeaway is that when people are under strain, it is still possible for them to be creative, though even within a creative space, it is often very difficult for them to imagine anything new. No wonder, perhaps, that it seems to me that the things we in the present may well be worried about in the future, a crisis whose scale and scope can be difficult to anticipate, appears to us in the present frequently in the shape of an extinction event that has already happened. The examples we've considered today, Solnit's Guardian column, Dinosaur Couch's Meteor comic, and the graph of IUCN data calculating extinction rates, are all in different ways scratching at the limits of what can be imagined within their respective forms, creating texts that flail in their genres, reverberating there as irony or inadequacy or some of both, as the case may be. Still, these works are not unimaginative, and their authors are likely not immune to or unmotivated by the way the present feels. Accordingly, it seems likely that the shared inability among these examples to address the problem of climate or other crisis in any satisfying way stems not from what Amitav Ghosh has called a lack of imagination, so much as a very different kind of imaginative response. Paucity of conceptual vocabulary, lack of imagination, non-comprehension, these can be the result of a failure to take in information. But regarding our present and the examples we've seen about how the present feels, these circumstances might better be understood as the result of a saturation or flooding of information that overwhelms the capacity of standard modes of intake. Right? The thing about not being able to imagine something is not necessarily that you're not trying. The most familiar version of this kind of saturation management is the fairly capacious category we call trauma, though this is certainly not the only way a person registers or manages the experience of being overwhelmed. While I don't think trauma is an appropriate or even accurate description of this paper's examples, Solnit's Guardian column, Dinosaur Couch's Meteor comic, and the graph of IUCN data calculating extinction rates, each does seem to register some amount of overwhelm. These examples might fairly be seen as expressing not trauma maybe, but alternate styles of managing that overwhelm. In this light, their genres, strained as they appear, might be seen as evidence of those alternate styles of management. That is, these three examples may seem noticeably small, slight, perhaps random, but what all three have in common is a smallness that is very possibly indexing something large, something indeed that's meaningfully out of scale, that perhaps can't be indexed any other way. What does the present feel like? The present often feels overwhelming, an overwhelm whose management, as we have seen, can entail strain on our genres, rendering them inadequate, in need of revision, or just ironic, and yet doesn't seem to create new ones. That feeling leaves us frequently trying to address the future in the terms of the past. The feelings of the present are, in this way, not always easy to express, because what's overwhelming about the present isn't readily comprehensible, pushing our affective responses into the realm of displacements, symptoms, senses, or impressions, whose apparent cause is so out of scale with its effects that the cause, to all appearances, has gone missing. There are different ways to recover that cause, to parse or assemble the complexity of the present, and theory, as I've presented it to you, as a method of testing examples for patterns, and vice versa, is one way. In this account of things, the ways the parts fail to add up to a recognizable whole, or elsewhere the ways the parts add up to a whole that is too recognizable, either way tells us something about the directions we may need to theorize into, the things we might be testing for. But in the meantime, just because it can be difficult to say how the present feels, doesn't mean we don't feel it.